globally advocate in an effective way for animals and to try to make changes in animal law. That's my thesis, okay? Now, how do we get there? How do we develop these principles? How do we generate or manufacture these principles? I'm going to propose a particular way of doing that, okay? I'm going to suggest one way of doing that. And the way I'm going to suggest doing that is based upon, very loosely, feminist care theory, okay? And in a sense, you could also say that what I'm suggesting is based upon David Hume's moral philosophy. I mean, it's the same idea that feminist care theorists use. And here's the idea. The idea is that moral and ethical principles do not arise out of any rational argument. They arise out of feelings. They arise out of emotions. They arise out of compassion, sympathy, empathy. Those are feelings, those are emotions that generate moral principles, okay? In other words, you cannot generate a moral principle from a rational argument. The only way you get moral principles is from emotions, okay? From feelings. That's where they come from, okay? Now, by the way, the most famous recent philosophers relating to animal rights and animal issues, Peter Singer and Tom Reagan, reject this completely. Okay? You read Tom Reagan, you read Peter Singer, and one of the first things they say in their books is that they're not talking about this, they're not making their arguments based upon the idea that they care about animals or they love animals or that they're particularly concerned about animals. I mean, Peter Singer goes out of his way to say, I don't really care much about animals. That's not what this is about. What it's about, according to Peter Singer and Tom Reagan, is that all they are doing is making a rational argument. All you have to do is follow the logic of what they're saying, and you will come to the same conclusion they are. You will come to the conclusion in Tom Reagan's book that animals should have rights. Okay? That's what they're arguing. Okay? I am arguing exactly, completely, totally the opposite. Okay? I am saying that I am here, and I am arguing what I am arguing, and I am saying what I am saying, and I do what I do for my career because I care. Because I have certain feelings about what is done to animals and people and so on. Is caring, in my view, that results in moral propositions and ethical propositions, okay? And so, the universal principles that I am going to try to develop here are based upon this idea of feeling and caring and so on, all right? Now, feminist care theory tends to focus on sympathy, empathy, compassion as being the foundations of moral principles. And I suppose I could say the same thing. But I'm not going to say the same thing. And the reason I'm not going to say the same thing is because compassion, empathy, and sympathy are English words, okay? And I'm trying to generate something. I'm trying to generate principles from a universal perspective. And the fact is that different languages and different cultures categorize and describe emotions in different ways. So I don't want to use a particular English word or group of English words. So what I wanted to come up with was a functional sort of idea, a functional sort of definition of the kind of feelings and caring that I'm talking about that I think can be used to generate universal principles. And here's what I came up with. I came up with an idea of caring, okay? And I define this caring, and I hope it's a functional cross-cultural sort of definition. I define caring as the suite of feelings and cognitions emotionally sound humans experience in response to focusing their full range of attention on the suffering of others. Okay? A couple things I want to notice about this, and I know that this phrase, I mean it's not much more than a phrase, contains a whole bunch of stuff, but there are a couple of things I want to point out. Number one, I'm talking about a suite of feelings and cognitions. Okay? It's not just emotions. It's feelings and cognitions. It's feelings and evaluative cognitive processes. In other words, I don't think that there's any such thing as pure emotion. I don't think there is emotion without some cognitive content, okay? So they go together, all right? The next thing I want to point out about this is that we're applying this caring concept through attentively viewing, attentively observing the suffering of others. Okay? And being attentive to it, and being as attentive to it as possible is important in this process. And ultimately, my ultimate thesis, my ultimate idea is that if we looked at things and looked at suffering of animals and humans alike, from this perspective, we would find that across cultures, people would have similar sorts of feelings. And hopefully then, they would generate similar sorts of propositions and proposals and ideas if they were made aware in a proper way of the suffering that we are talking about. Okay? Okay. So, let's go back to feminist care theory for just a second. Okay? Feminist care theory generates moral principles from what are concrete relationships. I mean, if you're looking at something from a perspective of caring, if you're looking at it from a perspective of sympathy or empathy or whatever, what's going on? There's a relationship, okay? And feminist care theory, there's an observer and there's an observed, okay? There's a relationship. In feminist care theory, the general way of looking at this sort of relationship is they look at concrete, individual, particular relationships. That is, like the relationship between you and me, like the relationship between me and an animal, like the relationship between me and a tree, okay? It's all concrete, individual relationships. Well, remember what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to generate universal, cross-cultural, trans-cultural, transcendent principles, okay? How are you going to get that from looking at a particular concrete relationship? You're not. And generally, feminist care theory is thought to be antithetical to universal principles. Right? But I suggest there's a different way of using this concept of caring and using it in a way that doesn't require this kind of concrete individual relationship. And I think this idea of caring can be used in a way that can generate universal principles. And here's what I would suggest. Okay? If we're talking about caring about something, there's a relationship there, right? There has to be. Okay? And so there's somebody observing something else, okay? There's an observer and there's a subject matter, right? And in traditional feminist care theory, the observer is somebody like me and the observed is somebody like you, okay? My idea is just abstract those things, generalize both of those things, the perspective of the observer and the subject matter itself. Generalize them. And you can, in fact, generate universal principles. You don't have to be stuck in the concrete. And the way I would suggest that is this. I mean, look, don't we care about practices like battery cages for hens? Don't we care about veal crates? Don't we care about the way animals are slaughtered? These are all practices and, in some sense, institutions that we all have feelings about. Okay, so we generalize the subject matter we're looking at. We look at these practices, these institutions, and so on, as the subject matter of our observation. And from the perspective of the observer doesn't have to be me, it doesn't have to be you, it doesn't have to be any particular person. It can be a hypothetical person who has a normal sort of emotional reaction to whatever is being observed. And again, in the law, we use hypothetical people a lot. At least we do, I know, in American law and in common law. I mean, the standard, for example, in common law for negligence, the duty that I have to you, is a reasonable person standard. Okay? It's a hypothetical standard. We use hypothetical positions to look at things all the time in philosophy and the law. So I'm not suggesting anything strange. Okay? So what I'm suggesting is by abstracting both the position of the observer and the position of the observed, we can in fact generate universal principles that can be used in animal ethics. Okay? Now, let me just go through the process. Okay? the process that I would suggest we would go through in generating, say, a universal principle from the perspective that I am suggesting. First, we have the stimulus. That is the thing that we are observing. It could be a practice, it could be an individual animal suffering, it could be a group of animals suffering, it could be an institution, it could be, it could be society in general. Okay? So we have a subject matter, a stimulus that we are looking at. Then we have our hypothetical observer. Okay? And by the way, the fact that we have a hypothetical observer allows all of us to discuss this. We're all part of the hypothetical observer. We can discuss this and say, what are our feelings about this? What do normal people think about this? And we can all add to this. Okay? So we have this hypothetical observer. And from this hypothetical perspective, there are certain feelings that are generated about whatever it is that we are observing. And from these feelings, we can generate certain sorts of principles. We can generate general principles like intentionally inflicting pain on a sentient creature is wrong. Okay? We can generate principles like that based upon our feelings. And also, by applying evaluations, cognitive evaluations to our feelings, we can generate policy decisions, policy proposals, legislative proposals. Okay? We generate the general principles, and from that we use our cognitive ability to generate further policy or legislative proposals. Okay? So that's the process we would go through. Now, let me just propose or give you one example of the way I think this might look. Okay? Take, for example, and I'm just going to use this as an example. Take the example of a cosmetics test. And we can be talking about the Drey's test that puts things in, cosmetics in rabbit's eyes, or a skin irritancy test that does sort of the same thing but on the skin of an animal. And what happens? The animal suffers pain and irritation and suffers for some period of time and then is killed. Okay? Now, how might we apply what I'm suggesting to this situation? Well, the stimulus is the cosmetics test. The observer is this hypothetical person. The feelings that we are going to get out of this are what? They're, I hope, okay, if we're an emotionally sound, normal human being, I think our response to this is going to be that we view this negatively. We view this as a wrong. Okay? And so we might generate a general principle like torture. Okay, this looks like torture to me. Okay? Torture of a sentient being is wrong. And from that perspective, we then also apply cognitive evaluative concepts or ideas, and we can generate principles from it and policies and ultimately legislative proposals from it. Okay? So that's the way. Okay, I'm suggesting that we can generate these universal principles that can be used in animal advocacy. Okay? Now, I told you I was going to talk about personhood, and here's where I'm going to start. But let me just tell you the whole idea behind talking about personhood. There are these two things in the world, legal and, frankly, philosophical. Okay? I mean, this is not just a legal discussion, it's a philosophical discussion, too. There are persons and there are property. There are persons and there are things. Okay? There's nothing in between. I mean, there are some people who argue they're sort of this, that animals are sometimes sort of in between, but in my view, they're not. There's persons and there's property. Okay? That's it. And if you're a person, what does that mean? It means you can have rights and you can have standing in courts and you are somebody that is recognized in all kinds of laws and international conventions and so on and so forth. If you are a piece of property, you are recognized in none of that. You are an economic unit. Okay? So that's the significance of personhood. It's probably the most significant philosophical and legal concept that exists. Okay? Now, I told you I was going to try to tie my conceptual ideas relating to generating universal principles to personhood, and I'm going to do it in two different ways. The first way I'm going to do it is in a conceptual, abstract way, and the second way I'm going to do it is in a very concrete way. Okay, so two ways. Here's the abstract conceptual. When I started thinking about this, okay, talking about personhood here today, I thought one thing that occurred to me was, could I use this sort of process that I'm talking about of generating universal principles from a caring perspective? Could I use that? Would it even be possible to use that to generate an idea of personhood for animals? Okay? And I have concluded that the answer is yes. And here's the way I would do that. Okay? Look at an animal's experience, or a human's. It doesn't have to be an animal, it can be a human. Look at any entity's experience from all possible sides, from all possible perspectives. Okay? Think about all of the suffering that is possible in that entity. Okay? Like being deprived of food, being deprived of shelter, being deprived of freedom, being physically or emotionally abused, being confined. Think about all of the things that could cause suffering to an entity, an animal, a human. Okay? And if we think about those things, each of those things, from this hypothetical caring perspective, what would we do? We would generate a whole bunch of principles. Okay? We would generate principles about physical abuse, about freedom of movement, about, okay? We would generate a whole slew of principles that we could consolidate into, I believe, an idea that we could say, this is what personhood is. It is this conglomerate of all of these principles that you get from applying this caring perspective to every aspect of the experience of an animal or a human. Okay? So, point number one, the one way I think I can connect, or that we can connect, this idea of universal principles and personhood is that I think that in generating universal principles relating to any feeling entity like an animal or a human, we can generate principles that are in fact definitive of and that describe what personhood is. Okay? That's the conceptual way, the abstract way that I want to talk about the connection between universal principles and personhood. Now I want to talk about the practical connection between the two, the way the two universal principles and personhood can be connected in a very practical, concrete sort of way. Okay? I come from a common law legal background. Okay? And as I understand it, Finland has a civil law system, which is different. I mean, the common law comes basically primarily from English law, and we in the United States have followed English common law. And English common law is a particular way of developing the law that I am going to talk to you about, that is being used right now to try to have an animal moved from the category of property to the category of person. Okay? So I need to tell you a little bit about the way the common law works. The common law system is a system in which effectively judges make law. They generate law. Okay? And in common law countries, some very significant areas of the law are in fact generated in this common law way. Most of tort law, contract law, property law in common law countries has been developed through this judicial process, through the common law. It's not in a code anywhere. It's been judicially developed. Okay? Now what does that mean? Well, it means that there's all these judges all over the place who effectively have the ability to legislate. They effectively have the ability to make the law. Now, they're supposed to be, okay, governed by the concept of stare decisis, which is you have to follow the prior decisions that have been made relating to whatever legal question you're discussing. In other words, you are supposed to follow the decisions before you that have occurred before whatever case you're deciding now. But the fact is that I might get a case as a judge that never happened before. It's different. So what does that allow me to do? It allows me maybe to create a new principle. And, okay, in the common law system, there is the idea that in certain circumstances, you can just take the old rule and throw it out and put a new one in. Okay? In other words, you can utterly overturn prior law in the right sort of circumstances. Okay? So this common law system allows a lot of leeway in judges in making the law. Right? Now, one of the things that has traditionally been determined by common law in common law countries is the concept of personhood. Who is a person? Okay? So, okay, now, and I've told you before, there is a project going on right now in the United States that is trying to move some chips from the category of property into the category of person. Now, how do you do that in common law? Well, there are certain things that can happen that you can use as a foundation for changing the existing rule. Okay? How, in other words, I'm asking the question, how does the common law change? How can we change the common law? Well, there are a number of things we can point to try to change the common law. And one is what we call changes in circumstances. If the facts have changed, if the world has changed, if science has changed, if the economy has changed, globalization, if the social relationships have changed, families are changing, what is the definition of a family is changing. When these kind of things change, when the circumstances change, when the facts change, that's something that you can use to say to a common law judge, the rule ought to change because the world has changed. Okay? Now, okay, so that's one thing. Another thing that we can use in arguing that the common law ought to change. Moral and social development. The world has changed morally and socially. Okay? I mean, for most of human history, slavery was thought to be just fine. That's fine. Okay? Almost all of human history. What happened? There was a change in moral and social views. Okay? Common law can use those kind of changes to change the law. We also look at trends in legislation. Are things changing in a particular direction? Is the legislature behaving in a different way? Are they passing new kinds of laws that suggest we ought to do something as judges? And then the fourth way is just, you know what? Okay, the judge decides. The rule that we had before is just wrong in the first place. Okay, that's another way that we can change the law as a common law judge. Okay? Now, with respect to the issue of personhood, do any of these conditions exist? Well, I would suggest that all of them exist. Okay? What's the foundation now for personhood? Why are animals not persons and humans are? Well, the general idea is this idea that animals are completely different from humans. They aren't rational. They don't have emotions. They don't have feelings. They can't plan for the future. They can't look at the world in an abstract way. They just don't have the characteristics that are necessary to be what we call a person. The world's changed. Okay? Science has changed. The science of ethology is showing us every single day new things that show us that animals are much, much, much more like us than anybody ever imagined. Okay? I mean, bees are capable of abstract thought. We know that. Okay? We know that sea lions and dolphins and certain other animals are able to do logic problems. Okay? We know that chimpanzees and certain birds can do arithmetic. Okay? If you would have said any of that to a scientist 50 years ago, they would have laughed at you. And one other thing I always tell my students, in the last, 5 or 6 years, there's the news magazine Time Magazine. Okay? I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's, I think that it is sort of ubiquitous around the world, but it's a news magazine. Okay? In the last 5 or 6 years, there have been 3 cover stories on something like, the cognitive abilities of animals. There are 3 cover stories just going into the new discoveries that have been made with respect to animal, emotional, cognitive, and other abilities. Do you think they're running the same article over and over again? They're not. Why are there 3 articles in the last 5 or 6 years? It's because the science is going so fast and is learning such amazing things.